So great. Well, welcome as Jacob has welcomed you to the Fellows and Associates series. This is the concluding lecture in that series for this year. There most certainly will be a series next year. One of the great pleasures and joys and energy points of the Restorative Lab is the incredible group of fellows and associates we have. Largely fellows join us either as part of graduate work or postgraduate work or as international fellows who are joining the community to be sharing and supporting a particular area of research. And we have a range of associates who are generally doing research and practice related projects along with us. Alexa Dodge is a Hill Postdoctoral Fellow in Law, Justice and Society at Dalhousie University already, and it was our great pleasure and benefit that she was here and doing interesting work in the area of a restorative approach, as you will learn this evening. And so we were excited to welcome her as an associate, and she's working in particular as part of her associate work alongside the lab on a project funded by Justice Canada that's looking at a restorative approach to issues and incidences involving multiple proceedings related to domestic and family violence, and so has been providing some significant leadership for that project that involves stakeholders across the justice system and in community. And so we're really grateful for her leadership there. Her current research considers restorative responses to digital forms of sexual violence, harassment, and bullying. Alexa's research and social justice work more broadly is informed by her interdisciplinary background in feminist theory and socio-legal studies, critical criminology, and digital criminology. She has published on topics including the digital distribution of images of sexual violence, which we'll hear more about tonight, criminal and restorative responses to non-consensual intimate image distribution, the shortcomings of the criminal justice responses broadly to sexual violence, and digital technology's impact on crime, law, and justice. She is the recipient just recently of a SHIRK Insight grant, so the Social Science, Humanities, and Research Council granting agency, to explore young people's understanding of technology-facilitated sexual violence and to really consider the supports that they might need. We've benefited greatly as a community of fellows and associates from Alexa's insight and energies, and really excited that she'll have the opportunity to present to all of you tonight.
So hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And thank you, Jennifer, for such a lovely introduction. I truly feel strange presenting to all of you because I really feel that I'm in the beginning of understanding the kind of holistic restorative approach that many of you have helped develop or have worked with for years. So for this reason, I'll be regularly citing other scholars tonight, other scholars that are involved in the restorative lab here, because my interactions with them and their work have really deeply informed my thinking as I've begun to dig into restorative approaches. I also look forward to discussing your thoughts following the presentation because, again, I'm sure that so many people here have really great scholarly and practical experience that could really enhance my thinking so far on these issues. Okay, that button's not working. Okay, so today, I'll be talking about the work I've been doing to think through a restorative response to the act of non-consensual intimate image distribution. So non-consensual intimate image distribution can be described as distributing or sharing a nude, semi-nude, or sexually explicit picture or video of someone without their consent. This act is sometimes called revenge porn, non-consensual pornography, image-based abuse, or technology-facilitated sexual violence. For the purposes of today's presentation, I'll just call it non-consensual distribution to keep things simple. So non-consensual distribution has become a growing issue over the past decade, with current research finding that about 10% of people have been victimized by this act. As research has grown in this area, this act has increasingly been recognized as a form of sexual violence that violates victims' right to privacy and bodily autonomy. Non-consensual distribution impacts people of all genders and is regularly perpetrated against both youth and adults. However, in today's presentation, I'm going to focus specifically on non-consensual distribution in the youth context. So much of the response to non-consensual distribution has focused on formal legal responses. For instance, in response to high-profile cases around the world, several jurisdictions, both here in Canada and internationally, have created criminal and civil law responses to this act. As is often the case when governments are called upon to respond to harm, legal responses have been framed as the only thing that amounts to taking the issue seriously, and the creation of legal remedies has often overshadowed other options for response. While law has often been framed as the most impactful remedy to respond to this issue, scholars in this area have consistently found that in practice, legal options do not serve the majority of those harmed and offer limited possibilities for prevention and culture change. Criminal justice responses are focused on investigating and punishing perpetrators, meaning that this response is often unable to address the core needs expressed by many victims of non-consensual distribution. Victims of this act are often most concerned with getting assistance to immediately delete and stop the spread of their intimate image and to address related victim blaming, shaming, and harassment at the hands of their peers and other community members. However, a typical punitive model is not focused on expediently or holistically addressing these really core concerns that victims have. As Jennifer Llewellyn has argued, traditional legal responses focus on remedying the breach of the law as the requirement of justice, rather than focusing on, quote, the needs and responsibilities of people in relation to one another, unquote. So the dominance of law in responding to non-consensual distribution has been so central that even when the law is not explicitly used to respond to a youth case, legal and punitive thinking often shapes a school-level response. So schools often are primarily responding to these cases by suspending the person who initially non-consensually distributed the image and warning them of potential legal consequences, without discussing the relational harms caused or seeking to address the broader circumstances that influence someone to commit this harm. Additionally, even when broader educational responses to this act do happen, they're often likewise focused on legal warnings and threats of strong legal action. For example, police in Canada often go into schools and try to scare young people with threats of being charged as child pornographers for acts of non-consensual distribution. Jake McIsaac and Melissa McKay, who are both associates of the Restorative Lab, describe how it's often assumed that responding to those who commit sexual violence requires this kind of rigid, authoritative approach. However, they explain that, quote, there is much evidence that those types of adversarial models do not actually make us much safer. They also do not allow space for people to reflect honestly on themselves, their decisions, the impact they have had, or to be open to learning how to create different relationships moving forward, unquote. In the context of non-consensual distribution, the reliance on legal framings and warnings is likewise not the most impactful way to engage youth respondents and is unlikely to address victim needs or broader contexts. So considering the shortcomings of a typical criminal justice response and the shortcomings of using the law as a scare tactic, in this presentation, I'll talk about the potential for a restorative approach to non-consensual distribution. I believe that a restorative approach is better able to address the core needs of victims and the broader culture change that is needed. I'll explain that the harm of non-consensual distribution is often complex and emerges from multiple sources in a victim's life and community, and therefore is often more suited to the kind of holistic and flexible response that a restorative approach can offer. So now I want to talk about the multiple forms of harm that occur in cases of non-consensual distribution that I believe make this act particularly suited to a restorative response. So the initial act of non-consensually distributing a nude or sexually explicit image of someone can be a harmful violation of the victim's privacy, trust, and bodily autonomy. Yet this initial act is often only a portion of the harm experienced by victims. In many of the most tragic youth cases, this harm was amplified and extended by sexist, homophobic, or otherwise discriminatory responses to the victim. For instance, in the internationally reported case of Canadian teenager Rhizomatic Parsons, the initial act of non-consensual distribution by a teen boy was taken up by Rhizomatic's male and female peers to persistently bully her with slut-shaming taunts. In such cases, simply punishing the person who initially distributed the image does nothing to address the widespread acceptance and perpetration of sexist slut-shaming and victim blaming. Victim blaming and shaming responses have also been reported to arise from additional sources, such as parents, school officials, and criminal justice officials. For instance, youth victims who originally shared their nude image consensually are sometimes shamed and blamed by police, principals, or their own parents for their consensual act of sexual expression. For example, in a Canadian case of non-consensual distribution, a teen girl described one of the core sources of impact being the feeling of shame caused by her parents' anger and disappointment with her for having consensually shared her nude image with a boy that later shared it without her consent. Demonstrating the real level of harm that can be caused in this way, both youth and adult victims regularly report that their biggest fear in the aftermath of having their image exposed is that their parents will find out that they consensually shared the sexual image at the outset and will be disappointed with them, angry with them, or ashamed of them. So the harm in these cases often emerges from multiple sources, creating complex offshoots of harm such as parental shame, peer bullying, and victim blaming from criminal justice or school officials. These community and institutional responses can cause significant harms in these cases, and yet these types of harm are largely ignored by typical perpetrator-focused criminal justice and school-based responses. For instance, school policies focused on suspending the initial image distributor do nothing to address the group of students that further disseminated the image or the group of peers that have begun to relentlessly bully a young victim with sexist taunts. Likewise, the harm caused by a victim's parent expressing disappointment or anger toward their child for their act of consensual sexual expression may prove to be one of the most deeply rooted harms of this experience, and yet is entirely unaddressed and even unacknowledged by a typical response. So understanding the complexity of the harm in these cases is helpful for denaturalizing the idea of criminal punishment or school suspension as a necessarily fitting or adequate response. The harms of this act emerge from multiple sources and plug into various pre-existing discriminatory beliefs and systems. Therefore, these harms must be addressed with attention to the relational dynamics, discriminatory beliefs, and system-level failures that amplify these harms. As Hamilton explains, simply punishing the perpetrator often fails to, quote, help the survivor cope with feelings of humiliation, shame, and embarrassment, and retributive responses regularly fail to create space for the offender or the community to think deeply about why this harm occurred or how to prevent it in the future, unquote. So I believe a restorative approach is more capable of addressing such harms at both the interpersonal and systems level. So a restorative approach, as described by Jennifer Llewellyn, should be relationally focused, forward-focused, comprehensive and holistic, and inclusive and participatory. Such an approach allows for a consideration of and response to the particular circumstances and various impacts of an act of harm. In cases of non-consensual distribution, this could offer a space for respondents to understand the harm they caused and contribute to a solution, for victims to express the nature of the harm they've experienced in all of its complexity and receive personalized supports, and for attention to be given to how bystanders, communities, and institutions may need to transform themselves to address current and future harms of this kind. When considering youth cases, restorative approaches in schools could be particularly successful, as they've shown to be effective for responding to the kinds of bullying behaviors and discriminatory beliefs that are often involved in cases of non-consensual distribution. Restorative approaches in schools require a reimagining of typical responses to conflict because they focus not on wrongdoing as a violation of school rules, but rather as a violation of relationships in the school and broader community. As Restorative Lab Associate Diane Crocker has explained, wrongdoers are helped to understand the consequences of their behavior in a way that develops relational thinking, to understand how their actions negatively impacted relationships in the school and broader community. Restorative approaches in schools research has found that youth are unlikely to refrain from harmful behavior just because there is a law or a rule. Rather, they're more likely to change their behavior if those close to them express their disappointment in the behavior and help them understand the relational harms that it's causing. A relationally focused restorative approach in schools could also help to address the ways institutions, communities, and cultures can aggravate and extend the harm of non-consensual distribution. Llewellyn explains that a relational approach should be broadly understood as, quote, extending beyond interpersonal relationships to relations at the level of groups, of institutions, of systems, and of society, unquote. This approach allows for a consideration of harms that might implicate a school's culture and policy and broader community beliefs. To look at the broader context in this way is not to excuse the behaviors of initial image distributors, but rather to take stock of and work to address the complex systemic factors that are influencing and aggravating harms. Fanya Davis, another one of the associates of the Restorative Lab, provides great insight on the positive impacts that a restorative approach in schools can have in this broader sense. Speaking to her experience co-founding Restorative Justice for Oakland Youth, she explains that in Oakland, they were, quote, intentional about implementing a parallel strategy of providing restorative services at school sites while simultaneously restoraganizing to achieve systems change affecting all schools, unquote. This meant they took an approach that included both on-the-ground work with students, families, and educators, and engaged in advocacy for systems change with policymakers. When I interviewed restorative approaches experts in Nova Scotia about how to respond restoratively to non-consensual distribution and cyberbullying, one expert explained some more details of what this can look like in practice. So bringing together the relationally focused and forward-focused principles of a restorative approach, this interviewee explained that you must use individual cases as a catalyst for broader change so that you don't see the same issues arising among a new cohort of students the following year. So if an act of non-consensual distribution was motivated by sexist beliefs, a restorative approach would seek to address not just the way sexist beliefs negatively impacted the relationship between the particular youths involved, but would also look at how the school as an institution might be normalizing gender inequality. This interviewee explained how a school culture might send the message that gender inequality is acceptable by, for instance, emphasizing male sports over female sports. He explained, quote, if we're structuring our sports funding around gender, then we're clearly signaling that girls and boys are unequal. So with this approach, you need to be thinking about all of what is happening in your building, unquote. In this way, individual moments of harm become catalysts for asking broader questions, such as what policy or practice needs to change in this building, and what different conversations do we need to be having with students, and how do we hold individuals accountable in a meaningful way while also addressing our collective responsibility for the incident. A restorative response will also be better able to understand what harms and what forms of healing actually matter most for the parties involved. For instance, many youth victims may be less concerned with seeing the initial perpetrator pay for their actions than they are with healing the relational impact to their family caused by a feeling of shame and distrust between them and their parents. Victim blaming beliefs held by a victim's parents that likely would have gone unacknowledged by a narrowly perpetrator-focused retributive response could be unearthed and confronted through a restorative approach. A restorative approach would also not assume that a victim wishes to engage the criminal justice system, but rather, as McIsaac and McKay describe, would work from a trauma-informed perspective that, quote, centers the voices of those who've experienced harm, listens to them with respect, and strives to understand their needs, unquote. The dynamic nature of a restorative approach would provide opportunities to address the unique needs of victims in particular cases, and to pay attention to the multiple sources from which harm often emerges in these cases. So while retributive and legal focused responses are often not well positioned to deal with cases of non-consensual distribution, especially those cases that may involve multiple people spreading the images and multiple bystanders engaging in bullying and harassment, a restorative approach offers a better chance to understand and address the complexity and multiple sources of harm in these cases. So now I want to talk a bit about the educational approach that could be taken in these cases, as a restorative approach to youth cases will often involve engaging youth in educational initiatives. Unfortunately, many of the existing education models in response to non-consensual distribution are inadequate and sometimes even harmful. Here in Nova Scotia, a government unit called the CyberScan unit that I recently did a report on provides educational presentations on this topic for youth that I found to be lacking in several ways. So I believe such educational approaches could be improved by engaging with restorative principles. For instance, here in Nova Scotia, like in lots of other jurisdictions, the current education is often focused on a cyber safety approach. This approach to education on non-consensual distribution doesn't seem to address the kinds of harmful interpersonal conflicts or discriminatory bullying that are often central to these cases. The cyber safety approach to education largely focuses on the role that digital technology plays in acts of non-consensual distribution, and therefore focuses mainly on discussing online privacy tips, such as don't add strangers on social media and use a strong password. This tech-focused approach ignores the fact that most of these cases involve people a victim is close with and knows from their daily life. So the cyber safety approach avoids the deeply relational aspects of most of these cases. As one of the restorative approaches experts I interviewed explained, quote, acts of cyberbullying and non-consensual distribution are almost always tied up in complex emotional reactions, responses, and pressures about sexuality, identity, relationships, and hurt. So it's just tone deaf to turn up and think that privacy or technology is the problem. It just gets the problem wrong. And then youth really don't listen to you if you don't have the problem right, unquote. It seems that those providing educational responses sometimes become distracted by the tech-facilitated elements in many of these cases, and therefore try to address the issue by teaching young people about privacy settings and online stranger danger. This, however, does nothing to address the deeply relational issue of non-consensual distribution or the discriminatory cultures and ways of relating that are often at the root of this harm. Nothing in a cyber safety approach teaches youth the importance of healthy and ethical relationships, consent, diversity and inclusion, or empathy. I think a relationally focused educational approach would be much more alive to these core concerns. As John Braithwaite explains, education as a part of a restorative approach can help address the broader discriminatory or cultural contexts that fuel particular acts of harm. He explains, for instance, that responses to an individual sexist act by a student might be responded to with education that helps all students at the school learn what sexist behavior looks like, how to recognize that when they have engaged in it in the past, and to learn how to speak up against it in the future. Such forward-focused educational responses are desperately needed in response to non-consensual distribution, as cases continue to arise in which youth express that their greatest concern in the aftermath of image distribution is that peers and family will think badly of them rather than supporting them. A restorative approach to education can also help to tailor educational responses to the particular context and circumstances of a school or community. For instance, rather than providing standardized cyber safety tips in response to the issue of non-consensual distribution, the attention to context in a restorative approach could help craft educational responses that engage schools in thinking about their particular school's challenges and the unique opportunities that they need for support in their school or community. As one of my restorative approaches interviewees put it, education can help, quote, build the capacity for people to understand their obligations to one another and impact on one another, to gain the capacity to talk about difficult things, and to begin thinking critically about the ways they interact on and offline, unquote. For example, you could open up conversations with youth about the challenges and supports they need to navigate their digital world by asking questions such as, what things do you consider before you decide to post a comment or image online? And what would you do if you saw someone being harassed online? A forward-focused restorative approach will also recognize that one-off educational presentations about these topics are unlikely to create long-term change. Therefore, using restorative principles to influence education in this area could lead to educational approaches that instead integrate learning and projects on this topic into the day-to-day activities of the school to help develop relational thinking and build trust among students, teachers, and community more long-term. And as I mentioned before, in terms of responses more broadly, educational approaches will also be more impactful if they focus on relational harm rather than legal consequences. Education on this topic in Canadian schools and in many jurisdictions internationally continues to largely focus on warning young people of the potential legal impacts of sharing intimate images. As one of the restorative justice experts I interviewed explained, presentations focused on legal warnings may have immediate impacts by scaring youth into compliance, but are less likely to affect long-term behavioral change. Impactful education has to go beyond making youth afraid of punishment and should rather help youth put themselves in another person's shoes. An overemphasis on the law could also backfire in several other ways. For instance, my research with Emily Lockhart found that youth victims of non-consensual distribution may be less likely to seek support if they believe it will result in them being pushed into a criminal process and having to criminalize one of their peers. So the focus on legal impacts and a legal response can leave young people feeling fearful and unempowered. Educational responses to non-consensual distribution can also be disempowering for young people when they focus on tragic outcomes as almost inevitable. For instance, educational presentations often focus on describing the most tragic cases of non-consensual distribution, such as those that ended in suicide, without acknowledging that in the most tragic cases, the harms experienced were often amplified by peer bullying and institutional responses that can be changed for the better. For instance, when bringing up a case like Rehtaeh Parsons, educators should discuss how the bullying by peers in the aftermath of non-consensual distribution aggravated the harms caused. While this case might have ended differently if bystanders had been supportive rather than engaging in victim blaming and shaming. While tragic cases can be important to talk about, youth need to then be encouraged to imagine what it looks like when someone who is harmed is well supported by institutions and community, and to consider what their role might be in providing those kinds of positive supports. Education should not leave youth feeling that tragic outcomes to these cases are inevitable. Rather, educational intervention should help young people understand that the culture that normalizes non-consensual acts is changeable, and it should empower them by teaching them that we can all help support a culture that values consent and rejects victim blaming. Educational responses in this way should really help develop hope. Hope that less people will commit this harm through raising awareness of its impacts and the reasons it occurred. Hope that we can create a world where cases are responded to with support rather than blaming and shaming. And hope that institutions and cultures can change. I was excited when I first started to learn about restorative approaches because I believe it can turn this kind of hope for change into action through principles and processes that enact change at both the interpersonal and institutional level. Carrie Grain describes hope as future-oriented and as, quote, an imagined bridge from the now to the not yet, unquote. I think restorative approaches help to make this bridge more of a reality. There we go.
Oh my goodness.
So, well, I've tried to show that restorative approaches to this act are really promising. This is the sad part. There are several barriers that might limit their application to cases of non-consensual distribution in practice. First, as non-consensual distribution is generally understood as a form of sexual violence, debates over the appropriateness of using restorative approaches in response to sexual violence may act as a hurdle to implementation. Some feminists worry that restorative responses to sexual, gender-based, and domestic violence can be unsafe for victims and may trivialize and reprivatize these issues. On the other hand, some feminists and restorative justice scholars are enthusiastic about restorative alternatives and believe these practices are capable of giving victims the agency that is often withheld from them in typical criminal processes, while also providing for more meaningful offender accountability and broader culture change. For instance, Daniel Delgobo, another associate with the Restorative Lab, explains that a restorative approach to sexual violence can be seen as less privatizing than the typical criminal justice response by addressing the broader social contexts that allow for sexual violence, rather than treating cases as an issue of one bad apple who needs to be punished. While debates regarding the efficacy of restorative processes in sexual violence cases represent a potential barrier, it's promising that many restorative justice scholars and practitioners continue to advocate for and find evidence of its suitability to cases of sexual violence. Another barrier to the implementation of restorative approaches is that it relies on a sea change in understandings of how to respond to harm and wrongdoing. Carl Stauffer and Sonia Shaw assert that a restorative approach requires, quote, a paradigm shift, not business as usual or simply a new program. It requires us to care deeply for each other, to see that when one heals and is accountable, we all become freer, to understand that violence is simultaneously interpersonal and structural all of the time, and that every restorative practice and mindset should reflect this interrelatedness, unquote. Experts warn that this kind of paradigm shift is not always easy to achieve. For instance, when providing restorative approaches in schools, effective approaches will require not only a commitment of time and resources, but also require staff to deeply interrogate their assumptions about how to respond to harm. Russell and Crocker provide a way forward for addressing this barrier by demonstrating how restorative practices can be effectively implemented in schools through an approach that empowers stakeholders and works, quote, from the ground up to generate radical change, unquote. While the path toward a restorative transformation in schools and communities might be challenging, typical punitive responses leave much to be desired, and there's reason to believe that overcoming these barriers will be well worth it. Finally, it will be difficult to move away from the continued dominance of law and the assumption that only legal responses can reflect a commitment to taking non-consensual distribution seriously. While there's much reason to believe that the relational conflict and discriminatory beliefs that are core to this act can often be better addressed through a restorative approach, there remain many school officials, criminal justice officials, and parents that are set on responding to this harm through law or legal warnings as a way to demonstrate that the issue is being taken seriously. Many interventions and educational presentations with youth continue to be provided by police and take a law and order or scare tactic approach. It may be a difficult barrier to convince schools and parents that police are not the best educators about these issues, and that legal warnings have tended to result in youth avoiding seeking adult support whenever possible. I hope that some movement has been made toward recognizing this need to talk about this issue within a context of healthy relationships and consent education, rather than through police-led warning sessions. But there seems to still be much work to do to convince schools and parents that this is the more effective way to educate on these issues. To conclude, a typical punitive and narrowly perpetrator-focused response to non-consensual distribution treats the harm of this act like the roots of a tree, shooting out from one central source. From this perspective, uprooting the initial non-consensual distributor adequately deals with the harm caused. Restorative responses, on the other hand, are better equipped to perceive the ways that multiple forms of harm can shoot off from the original source and take root in a victim's school, family, and community in a manner that is largely unaddressed by uprooting the initial perpetrator. A restorative approach is alive to the specific circumstances and impacts of a case and can be more flexible and holistic in responding to these multiple forms of harm. Therefore, I believe restorative approaches provide a more fitting, flexible, and holistic response to this issue that not only makes up for some of the shortcomings of a typical punitive response, but also seeks to heal harms that the typical response doesn't even acknowledge. If you're interested in reading more about a restorative approach to non-consensual distribution, you can access my publicly accessible report on the CyberScan unit that's shown here, or read my chapter on this topic in the Palgrave Handbook of Gendered Violence and Technology. So my CyberScan report kind of critiques the current response to non-consensual distribution and cyberbullying in Nova Scotia and looks at the way that the CyberScan unit that we have here could be more restorative and holistic in its response. And my chapter in the book shown here takes a more theoretical approach to theorize the nature of harm in these cases and the ways that a flexible and holistic restorative approach can address these complex harms. So thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to your questions.
Thanks so much, Alexa. As I was listening to you describe that beautiful arc of hope, I can't tell you how much I need to start June with a message of hopefulness in a way that is rooted in the possible and in the work that you're doing to make that possible. So grateful on both those fronts. We've asked folks if they might turn on their cameras and ask you questions, but we'll also monitor the chat, so you can send that, you can post your questions if you'd rather do that than come on screen. I think Alexa's also really excited to hear, if you don't have a particular question for her or the stress of forming the right question, to sort of hear how that landed for you, or your reflections or the connections that you made in terms of how this might be relevant to the work that you're doing or thinking about. So we welcome all those kind of interventions, and then I get to ask you the first question, because I can sneak one in while everybody is thinking about whether they want to be the first hand up. So I'm officially the first hand up, so you can now all be seconds and thirds. It's much easier. So I wanted to ask you to talk a little bit about some of the temptation, and you as you were talking about the harms that are actually most enduring or significant for those who have their images shared without consent. I was struck by the related instinct of those either who are connected to those who've been harmed, or who are, surround these situations in schools or in the kinds of communities where they happen, this kind of seduction or temptation to be connected to a punishment kind of response. And trying to think about the extent to which that's because the bad apple story, the sort of temptation to blame, isn't just about our kind of addiction to punishment, but is because it's easier to sort of believe that it's about bad behavior or bad actors, because then it's not about all of us, or because it asks less of us. Or I was thinking in the position of the parents who want to find someone to blame so that they don't have to think about their implications and the kinds of harm that people are or that their loved ones are suffering. And I thought that's both, makes, as you make the case, a restorative approach more important, but also makes it harder for people. Like it's harder to step into that messiness of this pain and stuff. And I just wondered if that has come through to you as you've kind of thought about overcoming people's resistance? Like how much of that resistance is just kind of these habits of ways of thinking about blame and bad apples, or whether it really serves some kind of a purpose for us in terms of our comfort zones and the kind of stories we want to tell about this. So I was anxious to hear your kind of thoughts and reflections from your research and interviews.
Yeah, I think absolutely part of it is that desire to put it all on this one bad apple. And I think another part of it that's really strong, especially in the youth context, is a desire to put it at what's seen as the most serious level so that people can feel that they've done enough. I think especially in Nova Scotia, I think we've talked about this before, Jennifer, after the Rehtaeh Parsons case, which is a case here where intimate images were distributed without consent, and then bullying and harassment followed, and Rehtaeh unfortunately died by suicide. There's a real fear here, and I think in lots of places where similar cases have happened internationally, that you won't have done enough and that the worst will happen. And so I think sometimes for schools and also for parents, they feel that there's a comfort in saying that they called the police and that it's in the hands of the police because now we've done everything we possibly could. And so part of it is the need to change the idea that that's actually what's going to be best for anyone in most cases. So in most cases, we need to understand that the series of events that puts in motion is often not the most helpful for the victim, and is often not the most helpful for the young person to take accountability. I often think about how a young person that's responded to in the criminal justice system, when I've spoken to some young people that have been involved with the criminal justice system that, you know, haven't yet done this kind of work, they often are able to say, oh, I can't believe I got punished for this. This is so ridiculous. My parents freaked out, or the school freaked out, and the police got involved, and now this has become a way bigger thing than it needed to. And it's really not that big of a deal. I didn't really do anything wrong. And so the story that they tell when they go back to school to their friends is that this person that was victimized actually started this whole ball rolling by getting the police involved, and now their life is ruined and it's everyone else's fault. And so often that's the lesson that comes out of a criminal justice involvement, where I hope that the lesson that comes out of a restorative and educational approach for youth is often one where they do more so come to understand the harms that they caused and their responsibility going forward to help healing, at the very least, to tell the story the way it actually happened, to go back to school and talk to their peers about, yeah, I did something wrong, I really hurt someone and I really regret it, and not to keep telling this story about how bad the victim was to try to take the blame off of themselves. So yeah, I got a bit off track there, but in answer to the first part of your question, I think it often comes from, especially in responding to these youth cases, a really well-intentioned place of trying to say, we did everything we could. We warned them they could go to jail. We tried to scare the shit out of them by telling them they were all going to be charged as child pornographers and be put on the sex offender registry. So if that didn't work, I don't know what could have. And so we need to repaint the picture of that is actually not what helps youth learn.
So as it must have been a good off track, I didn't think it was off track, but it must have been a good one because it sparked a question that came through in the chat about what this actually might be showing us about the nature of online communities and sort of this move to try to be connected, that's so pervasive in terms of the way young people relate. And is part of what we're learning in terms of the need for these kinds of offline restorative approaches that are actually like in person in some sense, or at least more personalized? Is that telling us something about the nature of safety, of resilience, of well-being? Is it telling us, is there something specific about the nature of the technology and the way this technology is working that allows sort of connection without relationship? Is sort of the nub of the question. So
yeah,
a few thoughts about that.
Yeah, there are definitely ways that technology makes committing harm a lot easier. There have been studies on the ways that not seeing an immediate facial reaction from someone when you say something mean can allow you to really distance yourself from those impacts. So I think it's about, in the same way that we really have to encourage and talk about empathy and our obligations to each other offline, we have to do that online as well. And it can be more of a challenge when the digital aspect comes into play. Because a lot of young people do seem to be finding it easier, or they've grown up in a culture that adults have created, where there's this idea that you can say really horrific things and do horrific things online, and that those don't really count and they're just a joke and they're not really real because they just happened online. And so part of it is really to get people to think about that empathy piece existing online as well as in person. There's a really great podcast, I don't know if anyone else has listened to it, called Conversations with People Who Hate Me by Dylan Marin. And he finds people who've gotten in these, said terrible things to each other online, or one person said a terrible thing to the other person online, and he gets them to meet and to talk about what happened. And a lot of the time, an aspect of that, of why the person thought it was okay, especially when it's a young person, is, you can say anything online and it doesn't really matter, and the person's not really going to be impacted and they're going to be fine. And I'm always fine when people say mean things to me online. So I thought sending a rape threat to this woman would also be fine and just chill. So there definitely is a part of it that, as much as I don't want to blame the technology, it's also important to talk about the ways that technology has amplified existing issues of discrimination and existing issues of a lack of empathy.
Yeah, great. Diane, you are on mute. There you go.
I'm on it. That's interesting, because the digital component, but then I was curious as you were talking about the sexual component, because so it's, there's a sexual violation, right? And I've been curious lately about, and so I wonder your thoughts about, so what you're talking about is different because it's digital, but it's also different in the terms of the harm because it's a sexual harm. And the usefulness of, or the potential for restorative justice to grapple with the difference between a sexual harm and other harms in ways that like it's so unsatisfying that a sexual assault is an assault that's sexual. Like that's just an unsatisfying definition, right? So yeah, I'm just wondering if you think there's opportunities there to deal with the digital aspect of it, but then also the sexual aspect of it. Like if there's something that restorative justice has to offer there.
Yeah, for sure. I think restorative justice in that, like the relationally focused piece, is just so important for both of those, because it doesn't take it out of people's hands and try to act like it's this objective, non-relational thing within the space of the courtroom, but instead lets people think about and acknowledge and get into all of the really messy ways that it impacts their lives. And I kept coming back to in the presentation this thing that is so obvious in a way, but also just blew me away when I found it out, that so many victims say that the response of their parents for both youth and adults was the most important thing. And I just think that a restorative approach is so much better at saying, not assuming that we know that the thing that needs to happen is that this perpetrator needs to go over there and be punished in this and that way, but rather would take the time to say, oh, like, we need to do something about the perpetrator and accountability, but let's look relationally at what's going on. And it looks like for the victim, what really matters to them is that they're going, especially for young people, they're going home every night to a house where they now feel completely ashamed to look at their parents and be around their parents because of sex negativity in our culture and so forth. And so I love that restorative approaches offer the opportunity to unearth that that's a huge issue and to acknowledge and work on it.
Because that's different than if a kid had their iPhone stolen, or the parents don't have that same. I mean, typically they could blame the kid, but it would be different. Yeah, that's helpful. Thanks.
Yeah, no problem.
Awesome. Linda Mills. Hi, you are on mute. My favorite 2020 to 2022 saying.
There we go. I am retired high school principal. So I'm but in Ontario, not in Nova Scotia. I live in Nova Scotia now. it brought up a lot of things. In Ontario, at least, as school board I was with, there were requirements for principals to call the police, to suspend, to do certain things, even if they thought that perhaps another way to deal with this issue would have been better for everybody involved. But you're required in your job. This is, it's a fireable offense, so you're not going to do it very often.
Yeah.
And often you get a lot of pressure from parents to even go farther than the requirements of your job might suggest. And I've been in schools that had a police who were in the school once a week or whatever, and it depends a lot on the person. Some of the people who in that job got into that job because they really got well with young people and they wanted to do something positive. Some took a punitive approach. So it depended entirely on the person who was doing that job. The other thing that it brought up, there are a lot of things expected of schools to do. And I'm 71. When I was 71, when I got in school, finished my schooling to be a teacher, these expectations were not there, So people, even much younger than I, don't have the ability often to do this kind of restorative work because they don't come from that background. I often had male teachers wanting to get involved in the middle of a fight and, be the guy who took them apart, even though nobody's getting really hardly badly hurt or anything. Just let them, we'll deal with it after, but let's not get teachers involved too. So you're expecting teachers or other people in the school to be able to have the time and the expertise to do this kind of work that might often be much better for every situation that's not a terribly serious situation. I agree with you, but I'm just not sure who would do it and how it would work. Because I can imagine I've had conversations where there's a problem between a child, a student, and a teacher, and trying to have those two people come together and talk reasonably to each other about what's going on and how to make it better is not easy, even that's not something so serious as what you're talking about.
Absolutely. I mean, you bring up two very important points. So on your last point, I'll answer first. So I mentioned a bit in the presentation, Diane Crocker, who is here, did some research here in Nova Scotia on a restorative approach in schools. So reading her report would probably be very, very interesting to you because it gets into how you can do a restorative approach in the school and how you get buy-in from everyone. At the same time, I definitely agree with you that to do a really effective restorative approach in school, I would imagine, Diane and others would know better than me, but I imagine you would, in a perfect world, want a huge influx of resources and staff and changes like that, if that were possible. I have several friends that are teachers here in the Nova Scotia school system, and they talk to me all the time about how they can barely get teaching done because 80% of it is managing conflicts and behaviors. So I know that is really hard, and I don't like to put more on schools, but I think reading work by Diane and others like Fania Davis, who I also mentioned, really shows the way that a restorative approach in schools can actually change the dynamics in really powerful ways that actually help teachers in the long term, I think. So, but others know more about that than me, those specific approaches in schools. But then in terms of the first thing you mentioned, about having to report to police in some cases. So I talk about this more in the CyberScan report that I mentioned, and that's free to read online. It is a tough one. So this comes out of the fact that in many cases, non-consensual intimate image distribution among young people has been framed as child pornography. A huge amount of researchers in this area, myself included, believe that that's an inappropriate framing. I believe that child pornography and the ways that we talk about it and the laws that we created for it are all based on adults perpetrating sexual violence against children. And so to take that legal framing and those legal expectations and the expectations that it puts on principals and teachers to report these incidents as under the child pornography reporting provisions, I don't believe they should have to, because these are often, it depends on the specific case, but often you're looking at images that have been shared only amongst other youth. There is no youth that is at risk of adult abuse involved in this scenario, right? And that's what those reporting expectations were created for. So when I was interviewing the CyberScan folks and some teachers and principals here in Nova Scotia, it seems that in the Nova Scotia context, people interpret that differently. Some of them are interpreting it as them having to report to police, others are not. But regardless, most of them say when they do report to police and say, hi, I'm reporting this because I have to under the child pornography expectations, police say, okay, great, bye. Because police are, and I also have interviewed police for a different research project, and police are largely also annoyed that this is being framed as child pornography. They're still charging youth with child pornography a lot for different reasons, but they don't like it being framed as child pornography and, you know, taking up the time of officers that are actually in these investigative units that are dealing with child sexual abuse by adults. So it's a complicated thing. I recommended my report that I think that we should stop treating these cases as child pornography for that reason and for many other reasons, that it's very stigmatizing when young people are named as child pornographers for sharing images of similar aged peers. There was a particular case in Canada where I think 4 boys were charged with child pornography for sharing images of girls at their junior high school. And one of the boys was taunted for years, being called a child pornographer, and people saying he ran a child pornography ring, and he ended up having to actually move to a different province to escape it. And so there's lots of reasons why I think we shouldn't frame these acts among similar age youth as child pornography. So thank you for bringing that up, because it allowed me to give my child pornography
I think that is evolving too. I was stopped being principal in about 8 years ago. So it's evolving as time goes on, and we realize at first it was just straight child pornography, but it is evolving in Ontario as well. But
yeah, and a lot of people thought that I know Andrea Slane often talks about how in her understanding, the reason, or one of the major reasons for creating the non-consensual intimate image distribution law, was so that you wouldn't be charging youth with child pornography. You'd instead be using this new law. But we're often seeing police charging young people now with non-consensual intimate image distribution and child pornography. Yeah, maybe just to see what sticks, but clearly they're both going to stick. So I don't know why they keep doing it, but they do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. That was a great discussion. I have Jennifer up next, and then I have a question in the chat from Erin Kennedy. So Jennifer.
Hi. So I am Jennifer. I'm sitting in the northern part of Nova Scotia in Amherst. I'm with the local restorative justice agency there, Cumberland Restorative Justice, and I've been with that agency in many different roles for over 20 years. And like Linda's comment, like this is not something we dealt with 20 years ago. It's new. And I just wanted to say that I appreciate the differentiation, like distinction between the non-consensual distribution of intimate images being different than child pornography, just because of the moratorium in Nova Scotia on sexual offenses and things like that, that it gets really complicated and messy. But when I first put my hand up, I actually had something else on my mind as a mother of a 19-year-old girl. In conversations that I've had to have with her even recently, because she's in university now, I had read about, like, within the last week or a little over a week ago, I think, about one of those extreme cases of a 17-year-old boy, I think it was in California, who committed suicide because of sextortion. And he had been communicating online with someone who he believed was like a teenage female, but it was an adult male who took advantage and convinced him to share the picture. And his mom went public because she had tucked him into bed, like every mother of a 17-year-old boy does, right, Jennifer? Like, tuck him into bed, said goodnight at 10 p.m. And at 2 a.m. he had taken his own life by then, because it happened so fast. And the perpetrator had demanded $5,000, which he didn't have. He was scared to death and left a note saying that he was so afraid of the shame and embarrassment he was going to cause to his family.
Yeah.
So, I mean, restorative justice, restorative approach, whatever. And that's what I'm just thinking, listening to you and thinking of that story, and go, nobody ever had a chance to respond, unlike Rehtaeh Parsons, where there was opportunities to respond differently. And so I just wanted to point out, like, yes, it's an extreme case. Yes, it's in California, but I immediately said to my daughter, like, this happened. And I'm thinking it's more likely that a young person would go to a friend first before a parent if they're really
absolutely.
So to say, if a friend ever says this to you or anything at all similar, like, just tell them to go to an adult. Don't be afraid, just because you are a victim of this happening. So it was sad that I had that conversation, but I shared it on Facebook and said, hey, parents, read this, talk to your kids. It's so scary. And make sure that you know who you are communicating with online.
Yeah. And I mean, again, with that piece, I think there is a way that you could have responded to that before it happened. And it is that culture change piece and the way we talk about it in schools piece. Because again, like I said, it's this thing where people are often going into schools and they're talking about the most tragic cases. And then they're saying, see, so never share your image because that's what's going to happen. Okay, bye. You're scared to death now. Right. And that's that hope piece that I'm talking about, that we have to give youth this piece of hope and this piece of empowerment to say, in the past, there's been these tragic results. Let's not let that happen at this school. If someone shares your image or somehow gets your image without consent, know that this one teacher or this one person is someone you can go to that isn't going to shame you. And teach young people that if someone comes to them with this, what are the skills they can, even if they decide that they don't want to report to anyone, because we know that in the vast majority of cases, young people aren't going to report to an adult, to empower them by pointing them to the many online resources that talk about how to get images down, that talk about what to do if you're being sextorted, all of those different kinds of resources. And also just talking to them about how one of the most powerful things you can do is to be supportive and not judgmental when someone comes to you. So I think even, if you're someone who's then talked to their child beforehand about, if this happens to a friend, even if you don't say if it happens to you, but if this happens to one of your friends, I want you to know how to support them. And I want you to know to be supportive. That's going to be a very different message in their mind if that should ever happen to them, that was what you were saying, was that you would want to see support in response and not shame. So I think that's a really important piece. And then I also just wanted to say, since you're in Cumberland County, I did an interview with the Sexual Health Center for Cumberland. That's recorded online. I had a great discussion with the Sexual Health Center there in Cumberland. And it sounds like they are doing really, Renee, and it sounds like she is doing absolutely amazing work in the way that I've talked about, to integrate these conversations into discussions of consent and into broader conversations about healthy relationships and empathy, so that it becomes part of those broader lessons and doesn't become this standalone terror thing that it feels like if that happens, it's just the end and there's nothing that can happen. So I think
it is still really about relationships. It's the relationships as the preventative piece, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Thanks.
So Erin Kennedy has a question, and is just someplace where both getting video and voice to work to cooperate with us on Zoom isn't working, so so has invested the time to type it out. So here's I'm gonna read it and then you can respond. I have what's more of a comment, but also a question. It sounds that the threat of criminal consequences is not working as deterrence, but it's still held as a type of compensation by victims' families. Is part of the restorative approach in this context to highlight and clarify that compensation is not only available through criminal consequences, but through acknowledgement of the wrong or an opportunity to have discussions and an ability to change?
Yeah, I don't think that criminal responses are always bad. I think that they're not the best response and they're not the desired response in the vast majority of cases. And then we know that from the research. So I think we need alternative responses, but certainly in some cases they can be useful. And I think more often those cases, from what I've read, seem to be in the adult context, where you have cases where, you know, there's some cases like victims sometimes contact me because they don't know who else to contact, which is very concerning to me, because I'm an academic and it's sad if that's the best person that you can find to contact when you're in this kind of crisis. But victims of this act often contact me, and the ones who contact me are often people who are in an adult context and are having images consistently reshared. They're trying to get them down and the person is spending a considerable amount of time reposting them, or has considerable power, or there's a domestic violence aspect happening as well, or there's a voyeurism aspect happening as well, where they are being recorded non-consensually having sex. And so there are certainly cases where a criminal justice process is the option that a victim wants and is the option that seems to be necessary. And in addition to that, I totally agree that in many cases, this act does have huge financial implications. And we've seen people in Canada get quite high financial, what's the word? Money?
Compensation.
Compensation. Quite high compensation when they've gone to civil cases with this, because judges in Canada have largely recognized this as a serious harm and haven't denied it as a serious harm, as some people were concerned because of the digital aspects. But yeah, certainly for some victims, the minority of victims, a legal case, criminal or civil, can be helpful for them.
So I wonder, Alexa, if another dimension of the question I just asked you, that Erin's just asked you, is about these expectations that we create. So we set up these laws and we set up this legislation and we sort of communicate that if you've been harmed, this is what you deserve, or this is what you're owed. And that one of the hurdles that moving to a restorative approach might have to face is this idea that it's not trivializing the harm, like that actually this case you make quite compellingly that criminal consequences don't actually do any of the things that people need in these contexts, except this puzzle, this enduring belief by victims or their families that this is what the system says I'm owed or I deserve, and so I can't kind of let go of that. So I wonder if part of this question is asking, like, how do we do that kind of culture shift work around what real compensation looks and feels like when the system is the backdrop for all this restorative work is often the criminal justice system and what it says people are owed. So I wonder if that's a question.
Yeah, it's that work of redefining what it means to take a case seriously. And so I think some of that work is really already happening in culture change. I mean, obviously there's a massive public conversation happening right now about what it is that the criminal justice system actually does in practice versus what it is said to do, what that actually feels like in practice for victims, how disappointing it can actually be sometimes at the end of a case. If that ending of the case and that finding of guilt is what you were looking for to get relief, a lot of people are coming out to report that they went through all of the work that it takes to navigate that system, and they got to the end and they went, oh, this isn't what I thought it would feel like. Because often what they want that to feel like is to be surrounded by support and to have someone admit that what they did was wrong and understand the harms they caused. And often that is not coming out of these cases. And so I think it's the work that we're all doing at the Restorative Lab to try to change the idea that that the justice response is necessarily the best or the most sensical or the most suited response to many cases.
Great. So maybe we have time for one last question, and I'll just say, Diane, I've had a couple of people inquiring if they would like to read more about the report you did on schools. Can you post that if it's available online?
I'm not sure what report Alexa's talking about. The article?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Okay.
I don't think I don't remember writing a report.
There you go. If you can put a link to that, and
then I also used Fania Davis's as well, so people can probably find that, her work on the restorative justice in Oakland schools.
And there's also Salia Gomez has a great new report about women and girls, particularly women and girls of color, in terms of the role of restorative approach in schools to be addressing sex and gender discrimination and their sort of place and belonging in schools. And that's
amazing.
That's a great report too that dovetails with some of Fania's work for those who have become really interested in that and growing out of your exchange with Linda. So the last question I have posted here, I'll do one final call after this in case you've had a burning question, but otherwise we'll, it is a lovely day here, and I do want to make sure that before the sun is down, Alexa has a chance to escape into the air. There's a question in the chat asking, are there any examples out there of real approaches? I take it what we mean is like real cases that actually happened that managed such a situation restoratively in the context of the sharing of intimate images, or this response, as Linda was inquiring, in terms of where that might not have happened with Cyberscan, but might be happening within schools or communities. So I'll offer that question to you.
I don't know that there are specifically, I mean, I was involved in a restorative response to one of these cases here in Nova Scotia, just through our restorative justice community justice society here, which was good. But I don't know of like a particular organization that's trying to do it particularly for these things, but I think it's one of these things where you can, if you're responding to other things restoratively and to other forms of sexist bullying, sexist harassment, etc., I think it just plugs right into that. So it doesn't need its own particular response, but I think could be plugged into these other examples that we've talked about of doing restorative approaches in schools. And then it's something that I'm still trying to understand how we could do restorative responses to this more in an adult context, because it is, of course, harder when you don't have that institutional base. But Cyberscan in Nova Scotia is one of the opportunities to try that for sure. But it's something I'm still trying to think through exactly how we would go about doing that. But again, it would be embedded in a question of how to do restorative in response to a broader range of technology facilitated forms of violence and other forms of bullying and harassment, where it would be part of a broader scheme, I think, of trying to respond to more things restoratively.
Is it the case, Alexa, I mean, I think it's the case broadly that law is catching up with the reality of our lives in terms of the ways in which the online world isn't well served by sort of our real world, or our not online world lives. So I think Cyberscan and those kinds of new laws emerging about intimate images have sort of created the space into which these questions are arising in a particularly kind of urgent way. And the pandemic has made, our lives even more so accelerated in this online way. I wonder if that's part of why we're seeing this emerge. And then I think, to your point, there's certainly evidence of doing this for the kinds of similar like harms that happen not online, not technology facilitated, or that are happening broadly. So I wonder if you say a bit about that, and also maybe the complexity of the places and spaces we've seen the greatest growth of a restorative approach here in Canada, in Nova Scotia, have also been places where there's been some suspicion, to Diane's point earlier, about whether or not the sexual nature of these harms and the kind of connection to gendered or intimate violence or to power imbalances has made that space trickier than the sort of bullying space to make progress on. So sort of that, you know, is this new because the laws are catching up, or is it also that we have some hesitance or resonance, like your slide indicated about, you know, why this might be a new horizon in some ways?
Yeah, I think part of it is that the laws are catching up. And I'm sorry, I think I warned them before that I might be coming down with a fever because my husband currently has a fever, and I really think it's happening. starting to lose track of my brain. So what was I going to say? I can't fully remember what I was going to say, but it was something about how I think part of the work again is like finding the spaces where this work is already happening and for non-digital forms, and bringing that competency around digital forms of harm into those spaces. So for instance, there's been a lot of work in shelters for abused women and supports for women who are experiencing abuse, to have those services and those frontline people that are already doing this kind of supportive work be educating them about how it can happen online. And how it happens in technology facilitated forms. And so part of it is finding the spaces where this is already happening, like in Nova Scotia, and just starting to plug in some competencies around understanding the technology facilitated aspects of pre-existing harms. And then I think you said something about why it's maybe been easier to convince in forms of bullying. And I think part of that is a misunderstanding of what bullying is, because I think we are already trying to respond restoratively to bullying. And part of that is this idea that, oh, well, bullying is just like kids kind of being a bit mean to each other. But the truth is that the vast majority of bullying is already plugged into issues of sexism and sexual violence and homophobia in ways that are actually already very difficult. And the fact that we've sometimes denied that in our approach to responding to it doesn't make it any less true that it's actually already a challenge in those spaces. So I think it's about both understanding how we're already responding to these issues, even if we're trying to kind of section them off into different things, and understanding the ways that digital technology has in some ways changed them and trying to catch people up with those competencies.
That's great. If that's you losing track of your mind, we can only all be so lucky to lose track of our mind like that. But I do feel badly for you that you have a fever, and you've done extremely well amid that to stick with us this long. So with great gratitude and to all of you who joined us tonight, and those who contacted us and indicated that they're enjoying watching these as a resource on the webpage. You can see how fortunate and how lucky we are to have this kind of energy and insight and the kind of cutting edge research and kind of conversations that it generates amongst the fellows and associates at the lab. And so this first try at a fellows and associates seminar series is a way of inviting larger groups of people into this conversation and into this community. And so it's been really exciting to have the chance to do that this year. And we look forward to continuing on with that next year. And so in the fall, you should be on the lookout for more opportunities to learn from and be in conversation with this community of fellows and associates. And so thank you very much, all of you, for joining us. Thank you so much, Alexa, for sharing with us your work, your brain, and the passion and the hope that comes with it. And we wish you all a good night, and we hope you get well, Alexa.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. It was great talking with you.